So now that the secret's out, the reason as to why so much of this channel has been about arcades over the past couple of years or so should be clear. They have kind of been dominating my gaming world, particularly those of the 1980s variety. And so, to celebrate this, why not have a little top 50 of favourites? This time, 80s arcade games. I did a full-on arcade list a couple of years ago, but this one is quite different in many ways. Playing and learning so much about 80s arcade titles in particular for arcade decades has, it's fair to say, had a pretty big impact on what I look for in games of this vintage. Many of these games are classics for a reason, and while naturally a good chunk of them are going to be covered in the book, not all of them will be. So, let's get going. This feels like a good kick-off point, something that's simple but also utterly cool and so thoroughly of the decade. Bad Dudes is the brilliant game that, in another world, would be the killer title for a crap action movie that didn't remotely deserve such treatment. The opportunity to kick and punch the hell out of a big ninja clan, complete with strong men, swordsmen, men who set themselves on fire, and some neat little cameos for Karnov and Chelnov, with the promise of being able to rescue Ronnie and have a burger at the end. What's not to love? It is pretty badass. The main thing I love about Centipede is that just because the game looks simple on its surface, it's a perfect game for the imagination. Donna Bailey and Ed Logg's title took a slightly different path from the golden age norm of Space Wars, and now you have to do some extreme gardening instead, punishing those insects and keeping your garden as neat as possible. It's a game that absolutely pops out, especially in a darkened arcade. It glows in the dark and pulls you in so effortlessly. This is proven even further by all the attempts at Centipede that couldn't help but add some sort of grassy background or whatever and immediately screwed it up. It's flawless just the way it is. If there's one thing that stops Marble Madness, Mark Cerny's masterpiece of architecture, getting any higher than number 48, it's that there isn't enough of it. Just a handful of levels that did end up being quickly mastered by arcade goers. But what a set it is, a phenomenal sprint of a game that really wasn't like anything else before it, where even the game's music points to something completely different. It may be short even by arcade game standards, but Marble Madness doesn't waste a single second. 1981's Jungler is one of those really interesting early games that should have got a lot more love. It's a lovely little title where you snake your way around a maze with your segmented creature, trying to take out your enemies before they get you. The pull here is that rather than a shot ending you or your enemies outright, they take off segments one by one, and if another snake is smaller than you, well then you can chase them down and eat them. This is one of those games where, even if it looks like you're in a thoroughly sticky and hopeless situation, you can still pull yourself back from the brink just by playing well. And I love that. A fantastic title that should have been more successful. Sega Ninja, or Ninja Princess, takes us to feudal Japan. We're taking the power back from an evil tyrant with shuriken after shuriken, going through several action scenes and turning invisible quite a lot. This one isn't necessarily an innovative game, it just does what it does very well indeed. The addition of that ability to ever so briefly turn invisible and dodge the many shots coming at you is something of a game changer. The mechanic that's really satisfying to pull off while also being neither too easy to do nor too hard to do. This and the general presentation is enough to make Sega Ninja one of my favourite top-down run and gunners. Great on the Master System as well, but originally a classic in the arcade. The ultimate button basher, the one which for a long time could only really be imitated, and the stage for one of gaming's biggest ever competitions, Track and Field is about as timeless as a Golden Age arcade gets, seeing as you could put damn near anyone in front of it and they'd be having fun trying to run down that track and make those correct angles in no time at all. especially if there's 2 players involved. Track and Field basically was athletics games for the longest of times. The graphics may have improved, but the original's gameplay was recreated a lot of times, seemingly deemed to be unimprovable. Now that's a legacy if ever there was one.
Wow.
A beautiful and sadly unheralded Namco arcade, Valkyrie no Densetsu doesn't even look like it belongs in the 1980s. It could have easily been released a few years later, such as the beauty of the graphics, the orchestral soundtrack, and the play it offers. It's a fabulous mix of top-down action and RPG elements, perhaps one of the best games of this sort there's ever been in the arcade. This is one I've only recently discovered through making my video going through all of Namco's 80s and 90s arcade titles, but it's immediately got a place on the list. Konami's Mikey is a fabulous mix of classic arcade fun with a load of actually hilarious comedy. There's certainly a lot of humour to be found in the rather surprisingly violent way in which our high school hero deals with all of the boring adults who'd stop him throwing kisses about, barging other students out of their seats, and generally causing unrest. It's a giggle to play, and it's certainly doing well with the soundtrack. I mean, you can't get too much better than bringing the Beatles in, can you? Officially licensed as well, I should add. Another all-time great that should have been a bigger title. Pang is one of the arcade's great casual games. The aim of the whole thing, to burst those big bubbles constantly, halving them until they disappear, couldn't be any more straightforward, and there's plenty of power-ups to help you through the action, whether it's the slower but surer likes of the big wire or the much more rapid gun. Not to mention other items like the dynamite that can result in more points, but can also be a little bit risky. There's no one time for Pang really, whether it's trying to go through a couple of countries in the game's regular mode, or having an even more straightforward bit of panic and just trying to last for as long as you can. It's always going to be 5 thoroughly awesome minutes. It's one of gaming's most famous tunnels. It's Tempest. It's the first time we're seeing the name of Atari legend Dave Tura, and it certainly won't be the last. This somewhat trippy vector shooter is a game that's forever etched onto the mind's monitor of many an arcade fan, and that's not just due to the inevitable burning those ultra bright lines caused. An absolutely furious game that gets a whole lot out of what, in the end, are just a whole bunch of simple shapes. If you were to just look at one of this game's components, you might wonder what on earth it's even trying to represent, but it makes perfect sense when it all comes together. It's tempting in some circles to not think much of fighting games before the release of Pit Fighter, because obviously that was the big 90s game that brought the genre right to the forefront of the arcade, and Capcom had nothing to do with it. But there are still some great and very playable fighting games made before 1991, and Konami's Yie Ar Kung Fu is still utterly superb. The speed is perhaps the most important thing, being that this is a game where you're able to jump and dodge all over the shop rather than simply lumber forward. And it also manages to pack quite a lot of moves into not a lot of controls, as well as a good variation of fights. Oolon's journey is still, after all this time, a significant and epic one. Donkey Kong may well be one of the more obvious choices for a list like this, seeing as how there's few games that are more successful and influential than this one over the entire decade, not to mention the way that this game changed everything for Nintendo. With all this in mind, I'm sure that the number 39 placement may raise some eyebrows, but then this is a favourite list, and thoroughly subjective, and as it is I love all of these games anyway. As it is, I am kind of terrible at this one, but I still have a lot of fun trying to guide the soon-to-be Mario all the way to the top of these iconic levels. We've just had a game that's about getting up as high as you can, and now, amusingly, we have a game that's all about going down. Elevator action sticks you on the roof of a building, charges you with finding important documents and getting the hell out of there by any means necessary. You don't necessarily have to shoot anyone, but there'll likely be a good few gunfights along the way. The classic 70s spy aesthetic still shines through. It's always fun to pull off some of the game's more intriguing mechanics like shooting out the lights, and it's highly satisfying to nail a crack shot through those elevator shafts, or getting the drop on one of these trench-coated enemies and dispatching them cleanly. This also features one of the 80s arcade's most insistent earworms for music, and as such it's not a game that spends too far away from my mind. We go right to the end of the 1980s for our next game, the legendary 4-player beat-em-up itself, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Probably not much of a surprise to say that all three of 1989's holy trinity of beat-em-ups are going to be in this list, and TMNT is the first of them. One of the legendary party games with action that may not exactly be complex, but recreates the Turtles' battles against Shredder and the Foot Clan pretty much flawlessly. It's the perfect game for the Turtles universe, and it came out right when the heroes in a half shell were at the peak of their powers, with the result being appropriately and justifiably massive. No way this game couldn't be here. There's obviously got to be a few racers in this dream 1980s arcade, and Chase H.Q is absolutely an essential here. The gameplay loop here is just a joy. You've got the big run to close in on the suspect, making sure you take the right turns, ideally not having to use too many boosts so you can save them for the second half when you're trying to bash the hell out of that perpetrator and take him out of commission. The graphics are beautiful, the music's got the goods, and there are, of course, all those memorable speech samples. The "Let's go, Mr. Drivers," the "Bear downs," the shouts of "More, push it more," and "Please" from your partner as you hit that rear over and over. Chase HQ sure is a thrill ride. We're sticking with Taito for a somewhat less famous title, but it's another one-on-one fighter that I've actually got loads of time for. This is Great Swordsman. This is a somewhat different and, again, quite early arcade fighting game where you've got weapons and you take part in 3 types of combat: fencing, kendo, and a gladiatorial fight to the death. You can go for the top, the middle, or the bottom with your lungers, using them to defend as well as attack, and it just feels right. Basically, it's a simpler version of one of my all-time favourite games, Bushido Blade. Obviously that game came out much later, but I played this one after the PS1 game, and it's right up my street.
Hello.
As brutal, visceral, and supremely challenging as Defender is, I must confess that I prefer my horizontal attack waves to be a little bit cuter. Sega's Fantasy Zone takes quite a lot of inspiration from the Williams Behemoth, allowing you to move either left or right and throwing enemies at you from pretty much all directions. But it adds a lot too. The bases that you need to destroy, the coins that you pick up and then use in the shop that's chock full of power-ups and new weapons, and of course the big boss battles at the end of every stage. It's all here in a thoroughly bright and memorable package, complete with some wildly catchy and bouncy tunage. One of Sega's greatest arcade titles of the decade, a title that showed they didn't need the power and pizzazz of the Super Scaler machines to create magic on the floor. We do kind of stick with Sega here, seeing as they reaped a fair bit of the rewards from this game, but in the end Frogger is obviously Konami's title. Indeed, it's their big breakthrough. The playability here is something that goes without saying. The act of getting all of these frogs across a busy road, over an equally treacherous ravine, and eventually back home is one of the great ideas and gameplay loops of the Golden Age. But there's also a lot of humour in Frogger, one of the first action games to really have that. Mainly because of all the ways those poor toads can meet their maker. There's no end of ways to die in Frogger, and even when you're the person responsible for the frog's safety, and therefore at fault, they usually can't help but bring up a smile, whether you made a very ill-judged run across what you thought was a gap in the traffic, or tried to take a piggyback from a crocodile that then turned around and ate you. It's a classic in so many different ways. The world of the 80s arcade is, I think, a great place to see some wildly different experiences that, when you think about it, are hard to get anywhere else. What's the thought process that goes into making a great arcade game out of being a frickin' paperboy and delivering the news to people? Whatever it was worth it. Paperboy is a brilliant and novel little cracker where you're rewarded both for making sure that your subscribers get the news firmly planted in their mailbox, or for trashing the windows of the houses that have spurned your daily offerings. And of course there's plenty of things getting in your way. Workmen, drunken old gits, annoying moggies, little brats in their soapbox racers. Everything about this game is ingenious, and the legendary cab, complete with its handlebar yoke, that seals the deal. The origin of many a shoot 'em up is right here. There's frankly an untold amount of games that wouldn't exist without Scramble, whether they're by Konami or not. And despite it being the earliest of the fixed scrolling shooters, it's still one of the most playable. You'll always be surprised by just how much this packs into a 5-minute loop, from all the enemies that come at you from both the air and the ground, the relentless quest for fuel to keep your fighter in the air, the journey from big open areas to slightly smaller caverns, and the pinpoint accurate flying you need when you get inside the base. There's a lot here, and it's still very special. Still a shoot 'em up that packs a serious punch all these years later. Staying with horizontal shooters, here's one that's certainly not as influential as Scramble, but is definitely a personal favourite. Saint Dragon by Jalico. This game for me is the pinnacle of the somewhat small dragon-based subgenre of shooters. You've got a whole lot of fire coming at you from all directions, but not only do you have all the firepower you need to answer it appropriately, you've got a big old segmented tail that you can use for protection. You only blow up if a bullet hits the dragon's head. This makes for a suitably different take on the usual shooter action, and Saint Dragon feels just right as a game. The difficulty level is tough without being too unforgiving, the graphics are great, and the music is absolutely outstanding. An absolute must play. Dig Dug may be a more famous game than Mr. Do, but when it comes to the art of digging around in the underground, Universal's game is definitely the one I would go for. Mr. Do plays somewhat like a hybrid between Dig Dug and Pac-Man, where you do end up making your own maze by digging around each board, but the emphasis is on picking up all the fruits rather than taking out the enemies. However, just like Dig Dug, you can drop the odd big rock on the heads of enemies who are following you. The finished product is a legendary title, one that proved to be so popular it did end up stealing the thunder of both Dig Dug and Pac-Man, at least for a little while. Another of the decade's great gems. Yep, we couldn't have this top 50 without Double Dragon. There'd probably be a few games missing on here if this title never came out, after all. Billy and Jimmy, masters of the back elbow smash, pound the pavement and chin everyone that gets in their way, with the result being legendary. Sure, it may not be the smoothest and most technically exceptional arcade game ever made, but it's one hell of a satisfying experience. If Technos had already put a big crack in the mould with Renegade, they absolutely smashed it with this game. An all-time great arcade soundtrack as well, just to really ram it home. Brilliant. The list's next bout of arcade action comes with the most iconic dungeon crawler on the floor, Gauntlet. This is another title where, again, it's impossible to really find much in the way of fault, with perhaps the exception of it being quite heavily inspired by an Atari 8-bit title named Dandy. Original or not, however, Gauntlet is exactly my sort of dungeon crawler. A fast and furious one where you wade your way through what feels like hundreds of enemies, wrestling your way through them like you're trying to get in front of the stage at a gig, constantly hammering those weapons and hoping to find some sort of path of least resistance, occasionally making detours for much needed health and power-ups, not to mention treasure. The Dungeon Master calls the action, and the mazes, they never end. Glorious. We're running, we're punching, and we're kicking. This is 1984's Kung Fu Master, another game that essentially created a whole genre. Takashi Nishiyama takes what he did with his previous classic, Moon Patrol, and removes the bullets in favour of fists and feet, adding on a rather meaty narrative for the time the game was released, as well as fine graphics and catchy music. The result is a classic and highly important game, one that was held in such high regard that Nintendo assigned no less a figure than Shigeru Miyamoto to oversee the game's conversion to the Famicom, because it was seen as that important to the machine's early success. And 40 years later, you still can't go on with it. This list is filled with so many classics that the difference in positions can almost feel a little arbitrary. In the main, it's just the gut feeling that I had on the day I sat down to place the games. But here we are in the top half, and Bobble is number 25. Obviously one of the most famous single-screen games ever to grace the arcades. Games like Bobble showed that the single-screen format wasn't really going anywhere, to be honest. Some may have thought that such titles may fall by the wayside as bigger scrolling games took centre stage, but then up jumps this legendary title. The core gameplay and presentation is great enough, but when you add in all the hidden depth that there is in the game, complete with tons of hints, secrets, and multiple endings, this is an arcade game that's built to last, and that's most certainly what Bobble has done over the years. Sticking with single-screen legends, Bomb Jack is another beaut. It's filled with colour and piloted by a hero who just loves jumping and defusing bombs, ideally in some sort of elaborate sequence. Much like the last game, the basic foundations of Bomb Jack's gameplay couldn't be simpler. You jump around and you hit those bombs. But again, there's a lot of hidden depth to the title when it comes to clearing those explosives. It gets so much more intricate when you're trying to score as many points as possible, and it's always a game that makes you think about having one more go. It is also, after Mikey, the second game in this top 50 to feature an inspired usage of the Beatles on its soundtrack. The arrival of Data East's Trio the Punch, a game that just about squeezes into the 1980s, is almost like a big raspberry to everything else. This is one of the all-time great comedy games after all, an utterly strange trip that features everything from an entire army of Karnovs to your character suddenly turning into an ewe, a Michelangelo sculpture that turns into a cartoon, and a thug that insists on beating up a tortoise despite your protestations. The game is hilarious in just how far over the top it goes, but it's not like Trio the Punch Never Forget Me doesn't also play very well. It's every bit as good as Data East's other brilliant side-scrollers in the gameplay department, and it stands as one of their all-time great arcade titles. One of those truly unique gems that simply has to be experienced to be believed. The Trinity of 1989 is back again, and this time it's Sega's Golden Axe. It's quite literally a slice of classic beat-em-up action as you pick up your weapon and hack your way through the armies of Death Adder, not just on a quest to save your kingdom, but also to extract some personal revenge. The action in Golden Axe is a fair bit more complex than what you would find in something like TMNT, with more moves, as well as the addition of magic and the Bizarrians that you can ride on, but this is another game that wins a whole load of points for its presentation. Golden Axe shines so brightly here, with so many great little details. Every type of enemy sticks out in the mind. There's the skeletons that move just like they would in a Ray Harryhausen fantasy, the appropriately large bosses, and settings like a village that happens to be on the back of a giant turtle. In the end, it is one of the arcade's greatest fantasies. There's one thing you'll often find at the heart of Golden Age games. You are, quite simply, the last line, and your goal is simply to live. To survive as long as you can before inevitably falling to a clearly superior foe. And few games sum this up better than Stern's Berzerk. You have this maze of endless screens filled with robots, and you've simply got to keep going as long as you can. There is no exit, nor even the hope of one. The robots endlessly shout warnings and insults your way, particularly if you leave a screen without taking out every robot inside of it, and the final result is, well, magic. You become so invested in giving this robo-army one final bloody nose, even if they will eventually overwhelm you. You'll still fight like hell in a game that truly was one of the first really remarkable shootouts around, and something that inspired an untold amount of other titles.
Must not escape.
Yes, it's time for the top 20. And we kick things off with that most carefree of booze-promoting classics, Tapper from 1984. Cute cartoon graphics aside, it doesn't take long for Tapper to become one of the most stressful games on this list, as it's all about trying desperately to manage these crowds of drinkers on the fly, trying to keep tabs on all of them so that you can possibly, with a bit of luck, find yourself with an empty bar. It can certainly become quite the struggle, as you know other patrons will soon be on the way, those last couple are taking their drinks, and suddenly one of them decides to drink up right there, you've got to chuck 'em another, and more patrons flood in. The whole cycle begins again, and all the while you've got to make sure none of those tankards fall to the floor. It's like spinning so many plates, and there is kind of an inevitability that they will crash every so often. It's an absolutely fabulous idea for a game. The final game of 1989's beat-em-up trinity is here, and of course, it's Final Fight. Capcom strikes the balance with this one beautifully. There aren't as many moves as there are in Golden Axe, but what's here has a whole load of impact, and the mobs of enemies are both large and most assuredly keen. And of course there's the big size of everything. It must be said that when it comes to sprites, Final Fight does kind of dwarf the majority of games on this list, with a whole variety of regular enemies and bosses, all detailed and colourful, all kicking ass, all moving smooth, and all pretty big. More than any other game in this list, Final Fight was kind of the one that showed the path to the 90s, and the sort of titles that were going to become massive at the start of the new decade. It feels much more part of the 90s than it feels a part of 1989, if that makes sense. And on the other hand, it doesn't get a whole load more 80s than this game right here, Crystal Castles, another Atari gem from the Golden Age. Something about the look of Crystal Castles, as much as there's not a whole lot of other games that look like it, really marks it as a part of its era. Bentley Bear and the topographic 3D maps he roams in are very on brand for 1983. But good lord, it's as much of a joy to look at as it is to play. A work of art. Speaking of art, this is also one of the most beautiful arcade cabinets ever made. Absolutely chock full of beautiful illustrations of the game's graphical style and a big blinking trackball. It's another key thing that makes Crystal Castle such a phenomenal title. The almighty Pac-Man gets in here at number 17. Now you may think this is a bit low, but this isn't going to be the first round of dot eating in this list, so please sit on those hands for a minute. Of course, this is the most influential bout of dot eating, the biggest arcade game of them all, the whole lot. That maze, the way those ghosts move, the power pellets, cherries and cutscenes, all of them are practically branded onto the brains of players of a certain vintage, and plenty of others besides. You can't exactly go far wrong with this one, can you? It's so ubiquitous, you can even play the game whenever you search Pac-Man in Google. Favourite games or not, this list is simply not complete without Pac-Man. One of the arcade's earlier attempts at capturing the magic of a movie is still undoubtedly one of its very best. Star Wars used a rightly famous cabinet, vector graphics, and a few choice speech samples to make you truly feel like Red 5, taking on those TIE fighters, going into that trench, and getting the perfect shot into an exhaust that's going to result in an appropriately spectacular explosion. The arcades in North America were slowly starting to feel a bit of a pinch at the time of Star Wars' arrival on the floor, but Atari held firm when it came to delivering a spectacular experience and not compromising on the game in any way, and it's a damn good job they did.
Let go. That is strong, isn't it?
There was a time when the idea of having a sequel in the arcade wasn't particularly common, aside from a few outliers. Said time has largely ended by the time we get to Rainbow Islands, one of many games that obviously shows the benefits of such a sequel. Rather than simply pulling off the same sort of gameplay that could be found in the original Bobble, Rainbow Islands changes all manner of things while retaining the spirit of exploration and hidden depth you would find in the earlier classic. A lot of hidden depth, tons of secrets, and a true ending at the finish. When all of this is combined with one of the most colourful and cutesy games of the entire decade, the final product is clearly a massive winner. Konami hit the list again, and this time it's the utterly golden Time Pilot, one of the greatest aerial combat games of them all, the one where you fly this futuristic machine through various different ages and shoot down all the other magnificent flying machines in each time zone. It's a bit of a high concept title, but the gameplay is on a whole other level. Flying around in this game, often just scraping past other people's shots, ducking and diving and getting those perfect hits in, no matter which way your fighter is facing. It's one of the most satisfying arcade titles around. On a good day I can actually do better at this than a hell of a lot of other Golden Age games, which certainly helps matters. Hard work most certainly pays off with this classic. Another key early title, this time for Data East, and yet another brilliant arcade that makes magic from something that's so menial. The simple art of constructing a delicious burger is transformed forever thanks to Burger Time. For anyone who's played this too much, the art of burger making will forever be associated with a little chef named Peter Pepper stamping each individual component down a well, avoiding eggs, pickles, and other items that would stop the delicious burger from being made, occasionally shaking pepper over them or crushing them with a falling piece of lettuce. One of the biggest Just One More Go games in the whole of the arcade, complete with one of its catchiest earworms, Burger Time is something that leaves a mark on you forever. And if my words aren't enough to convince you of that, you should go and seek out Brian Wagner, the game's undisputed world record holder, talking about it. Link in the description. At last, we have a Sega Super Scaler game. Right here as we get closer to the end, it's time for some Outrun. Few classic arcades speak for themselves quite as eloquently as this one does, and we can once again jaw on about how this is a driving game and not a racing game, but the carefree nature of this title is certainly one of the things that keeps so many people coming back to it. The music being another big part of that too, those epic, full-on and radio-ready songs that would become a trademark of these Super Scaler titles in particular. Some of those tunes feel like they could almost have been legit hits if they'd had some lyrics and vocals slapped onto them, it must be said. Now I kind of digress, but then, this is a game that does make you drift away a bit. And more than anything else, that is what makes Outrun timeless. And in contrast, here's a game where you can't drift away. Fight after fight, set piece after set piece, stunt after stunt. That's what you find here in Capcom's Strider, one of the most unsubtle action games of them all, and I mean that in the most positive way. And yet, as much as Strider does throw the kitchen sink at you, it's not necessarily a game where the difficulty is unforgiving. Far from it, in fact. In the main, it's just designed to make you feel like a badass, cutting through all these enemies with a massive sword, going from an epic battle on top of a snow-covered peak to flying down a hill, jumping into a base, then climbing up that and leaping from chopper to chopper, and doing this all in the space of about 90 seconds. Even now, not many other games can lay claim to being able not just to throw that much at you in such a short space of time, but to actually make it all flow beautifully. And that's why Strider is one of the very best around. It says a lot about the output of Yoshiki Okamoto that 3 of his games are in the top 20, and that doesn't include what is by far his most famous title. We've had Final Fight, and we've had Time Pilot, but outside of the obvious SF2, my favourite game of his is right here, Gyruss. Another tunnel shooter, one that takes the sort of dancing enemy ship gameplay that you'd find in Galaga, but gives it a whole new and game-changing perspective, and then makes the quite inspired choice of soundtracking the action to Sky's take on Buck's Staccato and Fugue. This is one almighty journey through the solar system, and another one of those games that I simply have to play whenever I see it. It cannot be passed up. Shinobi is a deeply special title for me, probably because it's the first arcade game that I truly remember playing, and playing a lot. One that was located in a video rental shop at the end of my road, when I must have been about 6 years old. We rarely even took out videos from there, as I recall. I would just endlessly drag my dad over to play Shinobi, usually falling at age-old foe Mandara and those bloody moving statues. This is the pinnacle of another little subgenre that's usually called walk and shoot, one that originated with Namco's Rolling Thunder. While that game didn't quite make my top 50, Shinobi has the honour of representing this slower take on side-scrolling action, complete with lots of ninja clan members to rescue, some of the most memorable boss fights in the arcade, and some of the most fiendish levels, particularly when you get to the finish of the game and you can't continue anymore. We're at number 8, and it's taken this long for Williams to finally appear. They only have 2 representatives on the list, but they're 2 of the very best games around. Games that have nothing but imitators. Games like Joust. Joust is surely the best you could possibly hope for from a guy, John Newcomer, who was hired purely to be a creative force. He gives you a game where you ride a flying ostrich and bounce against other enemies, winning a fight if you're higher up than them. What an absolutely glorious idea, especially seeing as it's controlled through measured yet usually frenzied button bashing. And of course this all comes with the Williams presentation. It's loud and thumping in a way few arcade titles can hope to emulate, the sort of thing that comes from years of pinball experience. What a stunner. There's some things you may pick up on if you've watched my videos for a while. One of these being that if Sega's the subject of discussion, it's probably not too long before Flicky gets mentioned. And why? Because I think it's one of the most brilliant and most underrated games ever made. A set of wraparound stages where our birdie hero must rescue all the little chicks and avoid cats, occasionally thwarting them with a well-placed throw of an item. It's a classic Sylvester and Tweety game, only without the licence. The stages are beautifully done, Flicky has a lot of momentum that makes efficient jumping and flowing through stages really satisfying, especially if you can take every chick to the stage's exit in one go. The music is ridiculously catchy. This game's flawless, and I think it's a crying shame that it wasn't way more successful than it ended up being. Long live Flicky. Here's a significantly more famous Sega title, the game that, for me, is still the undisputed king of their superscalers. Space Harrier came pretty early in the Superscaler line, and there's plenty more advanced Sega games in the genre, but Space Harrier has a special something about it, quite possibly the whole Fantasy Zone setting, which provides a creative surrounding that you don't necessarily find in the other big Sega scalers. There's the legendary dedicated body motion cabinet as well, the thing that admittedly was the main attraction for a lot of these particular arcades, but the game is absolutely the king here. The shooting action and controls are top notch, and the music in particular is absolutely triumphant, quite possibly Hiro Kawaguchi's crowning glory, which is saying a lot. This is another game that will quite simply never truly age. There's so much creativity, action and just plain magic in here that it'll always be as exciting on the 100th time playing as it was on the very first.
Get ready.
The top 5 is here, and it starts in a rather thunderous fashion. Thunderous is perhaps the best word to describe Robotron 2084. Indeed, it's a word that fits all of the Williams arcades, but particularly this golden title. Again, this is simply about surviving. You must try and save the last human family inside a closed-off and somewhat claustrophobic stage that's absolutely stuffed with robotic enemies, from the more standard grunts to the fearsome brains and enforcers, not to mention the big hulks that cannot be killed and essentially act as moving barriers. Every single shot in this dual-stick shooter legend hits your whole body like a kick drum, and that's far from the only sound here. It's all vicious, and it makes the game feel like even more of a frenzied fight than it already is. New and exciting games still come out today with Robotron as their main source of inspiration, and lots of them at that. Not only did this give birth to a whole new style of shooter, it is still the prime example of that style. To say that Robotron 2084 is timeless isn't just an empty word, it's an indisputable fact. And here's the top Sega game on this list, Alien Syndrome. One of Sega's less flashier games from this period, especially when compared to the Superscalers, but this is one that just has such an ominous feeling, something you don't really get from all that many arcades. That quiet heartbeat music certainly helps, as does the endless aliens, horrifying boss creations, the hostages that are trapped in those strange substances, and the guttural screams that come from the player whenever they get caught by an enemy. And it all adds up to a game that's very different and, for me, absolutely classic. And what a cabinet too. Seriously, one of the best looking cabs of them all. They sure don't make them like this one anymore, it must be said.
Go to the exit.
It's top 3 time. And I told you that the Dot Eater was going to come back, didn't I? Pac-Man is, of course, where the almighty Eater of Dots became so popular, but for me, Ms. Pac-Man represents the first time that this winning formula was perfected. It's so much more than just the regular game with a bow strapped to its head and makeup slapped on its eyes. The improvements here are what makes it flawless. Obviously there are major things such as having more than one maze to play in, but there's also the different behaviour of the ghosts and the moving fruit, the subtle speed changes. A whole bunch of little things that come together for the perfect Pac-Man. GCC did an incredible job when it came to tweaking the game, and it was something that helped ensure that Pac-Man was going to last forever. If ever I want to play the game, this is always my first choice. After so many classics, we've reached the top 2. 2 games that, even after everything else, are a level above for me. Although their position is hardly set in stone, I've switched the positions of these 2 titles several times just while writing the list. But for now, Namco's Galaga is at number 2. It's funny, just like the last entry, Galaga's main task was to improve on a game, in the shape of Galaxian, that was already phenomenally successful. It does so in ways that are both big and small. Obviously you've got the more major additions such as the challenging bonus stages, or the tractor beam from the boss Galaga ships that can give you dual fighters, but there's the subtle changes in the alien ship behaviour and in the way that your ship controls, especially seeing as it's now able to fire a lot more shots. The end product, complete with its constant bed of hums and swoops, represents the perfect classic Golden Age space shooter. A game that, once again, ended up being built to last. Even back in the day, it tended to stay in arcades long after all sorts of contemporaries that initially had performed just as well, or even better, had been taken off the floor or converted to something else. When you play Galaga, you feel like you're right next to the beating heart of what makes gaming great. And then, at number 1, we have Missile Command. Funnily enough, this was also number 1 way back in the day, when I did a little top 10 of my favourite Golden Age arcades, so perhaps not too much has really changed. Dave Tua's game is still the kin for me. We've had a few games that seem to be, more than usual, all about survival in the face of certain defeat. Berzerk, Robotron. This is the same thing, only on a whole other scale, defending cities against endless waves of missiles in a setting that, at the time, was particularly resonant. So resonant, in fact, that Dave famously woke up in cold sweats for quite some time after making Missile Command, plagued by nuke war nightmares. That survival can go on for as long as it takes to finally fall. In another twist of fate, this title's kill screen doesn't even end the game. But really, arcade intricacies do fall away in the face of this game when compared to just how visceral it all feels, how it immediately grabs your imagination, and how much you want another go after it's done. I can see why this game stuck with Dave Tua for so long, but it still makes me want another shot at survival. And how easily does this game grab your imagination? You don't even notice that it's all a bunch of lines, dots and simple shapes. How even the legendary Le End display is just a flashing octagon. It does not matter, because they all represent something far, far bigger. My favourite arcade game of the 1980s, without a doubt. At least until I wake up and decide that Galaga should actually be top. Such is the joy of thinking about these things. Hopefully you've enjoyed this countdown, and until the next time, bye for now.